Hi, I'm Robert McLeman from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. I've been studying the relationship between climate and human migration for well over a decade now. So when Global Development Network asked me to contribute a blog posting on the subject, I was really excited to do so. I don't think it's a great surprise to anyone that the news that the Earth's climate is changing or that human activity is the main driver of those changes. One of the more unfortunate aspects of climate change is that the worst impacts of it, increased frequency of extreme storm events, more severe droughts, sea level rise, river valley flooding, those are going to happen first and foremost in countries in developing parts of the world where the people who are going to be exposed to those risks were not responsible for causing the problem in the first place. Nonetheless, they are going to experience those impacts in coming decades. How soon depends a lot on whether or not we are going to actually try to curtail our greenhouse gas emissions in coming decades. At the moment, there seems to be relatively modest efforts on a global scale, in which case the impacts of climate change are going to start to be very obvious within the next 20 to 30 years. If we try to control our greenhouse gas emissions, we can extend that horizon beyond perhaps 2100. But the reality is this, is that we need to start thinking about what will happen to those people who are exposed to the worst impacts of climate change. Now we have a few options. One is do nothing and hope for the best. And that seems to be the option that most governments are happy to pursue right now. In which case, people are going to have to move from highly exposed locations, low-lying areas close to sea level, small island states, areas where water is already quite scarce. And they're going to move of their own accord to wherever they feel they can best do so, and that will depend a lot on where their social networks and where their cultural contacts lie. In many cases, it may just be short-distance migration to the nearest urban center. In other instances, it might be the migration of young people to more distant destinations in the developed world. We already see elements of these types of migration patterns already occurring in different parts of the world. But if policymakers actually do want to get involved and actually become proactive in this regard, there are a number of options that are available to them. I mean, we have the science right now to know and pinpoint the locations that are most highly exposed. So we know, for example, that at the mouth of the Ganges River, on the Bay of Bengal, there's a lot of low-lying settlements that are highly exposed already to extreme storm events, storm surges, flooding, and erosion. Those locations, those settlements are going to become more and more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in coming decades, and so plans will have to be made. Are we going to build protective infrastructure? That could be natural infrastructure like mangroves or sea marshes, and allow those types of shoreline protections to flourish? Are we going to build solid constructed seawalls and things like that to protect these communities, the way that's done, for example, in the Netherlands? Or are we going to simply relocate the people who live in those communities? A lot of that will depend upon the financial resources available to people living in those types of settlements. So these are some choices that need to be made right now, because it will take decades to mobilize the resources and mobilize the planning that will need to be implemented. Another thing we're going to need is an international agreement in which we discuss as a global community how we are going to help and protect people who are involuntarily displaced because of climate change. At the moment, there's some baby steps being made in that direction. We could look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and try to expand that to protect people displaced by the impacts of climate change, or we could come up with separate accords as well. Another thing that we can do, and I'm lifting this idea straight from the former president of the island of Kiribati in the Pacific, is that we can allow people to migrate with dignity. And what that means is this, is that we know people who live, for example, in small island states in the Pacific are highly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise and storm surges. And it's going to take huge investment to protect those communities, and even so, we may not be able to do so. They may eventually need to be relocated elsewhere. What we can do right now is make it easier for young people from those countries to migrate to developed nations, to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, to Europe, so that the young people right now can get some skills, some job training, learn languages in destination countries, and earn some money that they can remit home and help their households build their own adaptive capacity to deal with climate change. And the result of this is that if 50, 75, 100 years from now, those populations need to be relocated, they won't have to move like refugees. People will actually want them as incoming migrants because they'll be these highly skilled, adaptable workers. So that's the idea behind migration with dignity. And what it requires is simply using existing labor migration arrangements and kind of loosening them up for people who live in highly vulnerable locations. And then the final thing, of course, is we do actually need to think about people who need to move right now, right away, for reasons related to the climate. For example, there are communities in the coastal United States right now, in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, in the state of Louisiana, where people need to be relocated now because of sea level rise, coastal subsidence, and storm surge damage from hurricanes. What we're finding is that it's extremely expensive to do so. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to relocate small populations of a few hundred or even a couple thousand people. So one of the things that we need to recognize now is that if we don't do something to control our greenhouse gas emissions, the financial, economic, social, cultural, and migration impacts of climate change are going to become increasingly greater with each passing decade. So I hope you get a chance to read through not just mine, but some of the other great posts that you'll find on the Global Development Network blogs on migration and environment. And I hope that you give us some feedback on the comments section of our blogs. Thanks a lot.